I was wiping the kitchen counter when I heard my son-in-law's voice cut through the hallway. His tone was low, steady, almost relieved. Good. He won't be needing it much longer. The words landed so cleanly that for a moment I thought I misheard them. Then a cold feeling moved across my back, the kind that doesn't wait for you to understand before it warns you something is wrong. I kept my hand on the counter, still as stone, listening to the weight behind his voice. That wasn't a joke. That was certainty. My daughter had changed my phone password an hour earlier, brushing it off with a quick smile and a vague excuse about keeping things organized. I hadn't asked her to touch anything. She didn't even tell me the new password. I'd been trying to shake it off, telling myself she was just helping. But now, hearing her husband speak like that, something inside me tightened. I leaned a little closer to the doorway, keeping quiet as their voices dropped. There was a short murmur from her, too soft to make out. His answer came back sharper. Just leave it, it's done. I didn't recognize that tone from him. It wasn't frustration, it was preparation. The air felt different, heavy, like someone had lowered it around me. I stood there, frozen halfway between the counter and the doorway, holding my breath, every nerve in me listening for another clue. Instead, the house offered me a silence that felt intentional. I stepped toward the living room as calmly as I could. The moment they heard my foot on the floor, the talking stopped. I saw them on the couch, my daughter sitting straight, her hands in her lap, and her husband looking down at his phone like he had been doing that the whole time. The stillness in the room was loud. They weren't surprised to see me. They were waiting to see how much I had heard. My daughter gave me a tight smile, her eyes too alert for someone who claimed everything was fine earlier. He didn't look at me at all. He kept his face pointed at the screen, jaws set, shoulders tense in a way he couldn't hide. No one spoke. The room held a kind of quiet I hadn't felt in my own home before. Me on one side, the two of them on the other. Something unspoken sitting in the space between us. I told them I was going to lie down for a bit. My voice sounded steady, but my stomach felt like it was folding inward. She nodded quickly, relieved to let the moment pass without question. That alone told me more than anything else. I turned toward the hallway, feeling their eyes follow me until I disappeared from view. Walking to my room, the house felt longer than usual. Every step echoed a little too clearly, like the walls were listening. My mind kept circling the same pieces. My phone locked without my consent. The whispering, the sentence I wasn't meant to hear. Good. He won't be needing it much longer. The words replayed exactly the same each time. Not rushed, not uncertain, final. When I closed my bedroom door, the sound felt thin, not protective. I sat on the edge of the bed, letting the fears settle enough for me to think. Something was being planned around me. Something quiet, deliberate, and close enough that it had already reached into my pocket without my permission. I leaned back slowly, staring at the ceiling as the truth settled in. Tonight wasn't the start of anything. It was the moment I finally noticed it. I lay on the bed longer than usual the next morning, staring at the faint line of light slipping under the blinds. At 72, my body wakes before I want it to, but that morning felt heavier. I reached for my glasses, the same way I always do, and felt the quiet ache in my knees remind me I'm not as steady as I used to be. Since my wife passed, I've managed most things on my own, but lately I've needed help with little tasks. Lids that don't open easily, doctor forms that strain my eyes, reminders for appointments. My daughter used to help with a softness I relied on. That softness had slowly been replaced with something tighter. She wasn't unkind, just distant, as if each favor cost her more than it should have. After she married, her tone shifted. I noticed it first in the small decisions, telling me what I should eat, pushing me to sell things I'd had for decades, insisting she needed to keep track of my schedule. I told myself she was trying to help, but help doesn't usually come with the feeling of being managed. I felt it every time she reminded me, "Dad, let me handle it," even when I hadn't asked her to. Her husband made it worse. He joked often about taking over the old man's life, smiling like it was harmless. But there was something in the way he said it, like he meant the words more than the joke. He talked about my age the way people talk about an engine that's starting to rattle. I tried to ignore him, but each comment built on the last, turning into something heavier each time. I didn't say anything. It felt easier not to. What unsettled me more were the financial hints that started appearing in casual conversations. He mentioned inheritance numbers, as if they were future plans he was entitled to. My daughter told him not to talk that way, but she didn't sound bothered. They both spoke about preparing assets and planning ahead, always in the evenings when they thought I couldn't hear. I brushed it off at first. Families plan, but families also protect. And lately, nothing about their tone felt protective. I reached for my phone on the bedside table and remembered the way she had taken it from my hands the day before. "Let me update something," she said, tapping quickly on the screen before handing it back. I hadn't asked her to do anything. I pressed the button now and saw the lock screen blink at me. I typed the password I'd used for years. Wrong. I tried again. Wrong. I entered every variation I could remember. Nothing worked. The feeling that rose in my chest wasn't confusion, it was recognition. This wasn't an accident. She had changed it without telling me, and that alone carried weight. A phone holds a man's life these days. Messages, appointments, contacts, bank apps, medical notes. To take control of it without asking was more than intrusive. It was a step into something I hadn't agreed to. I set the phone down slowly, listening to the house settling around me. The walls didn't feel familiar the way they used to. The quiet didn't feel peaceful. It felt watchful. I kept replaying her husband's sentence in my mind, each time hearing it more clearly. Good. He won't be needing it much longer. And now, being locked out of my own phone, the meaning pressed harder than before. Whatever was shifting in this house wasn't small anymore. It was creeping into the corners of my life, one quiet step at a time. I found my daughter in the kitchen later that afternoon, wiping the counter the same way I had been the night before. I asked her calmly why my phone password had changed. She didn't look up right away. "Oh, that," she said lightly. "Your phone was acting strange. I reset a few things to fix it." Her tone was casual, but she didn't offer the new password. She didn't ask if anything seemed off. She gave the explanation like someone handing out a pre-written line, not an honest answer. I nodded, but the timing felt wrong, and the reason didn't match the way she had rushed through my settings yesterday. A few hours later, her husband gave me a different story without realizing he was supposed to match hers. He mentioned something about security updates and how older phones get stuck on old passwords. His voice was too confident, too rehearsed. The sentence didn't fit with her claim about fixing a glitch. They hadn't bothered to align their lies. That alone made something inside me shift. When people trip over the truth, you hear hesitation. When people trip over a lie, you hear certainty in all the wrong places. I tried calling my voicemail on the landline to see if anything important had come through. The mailbox was empty, completely empty. I always kept at least a few messages. My doctor's reminders, appointment confirmations, callbacks. Now it showed nothing. I remembered the last reminder coming in 2 days ago for a checkup next week. That one was gone too. My stomach grew tight. Someone who wasn't me had been removing things. When I walked down the hallway, I heard their voices behind the half-closed door of the living room. My daughter spoke in a low rush. "We have to think about the timing." Her husband answered, quieter still. "And the papers. Don't forget the papers." The tone wasn't angry. It was deliberate, focused. They sounded like people arranging something that needed precision. I stood still and listened, but the second they heard my footsteps, the room went silent, not softened, cut, off, like someone had pressed a button. I stepped inside, pretending I had forgotten something on the table. They were sitting apart, not speaking, watching me too closely. The air felt sharp between us. My daughter gave me a faint smile, but her eyes darted toward her husband before settling back on me. He didn't speak at all. He simply tapped his finger on his knee, a nervous habit he usually tried to hide. Their stillness wasn't natural. It was defensive. From that moment on, I paid attention in ways I hadn't before. I noticed how they carried their phones everywhere, even into rooms they never used to. How conversations stopped mid-sentence when I approached. How she checked the drawer where my medical papers were kept, pretending to look for a pen. I watched him sit at the dining table scrolling through websites he closed the second I walked behind him. Every small detail added up to something larger, something forming just outside my line of sight. I didn't confront them. I didn't ask more questions. I simply let the silence do its work and let their behavior speak for itself. Sometimes the truth reveals itself faster when you don't interfere. By evening, I realized I'd been treating everything like isolated moments, passwords, whispers, missing messages. But they weren't separate pieces. They were part of a pattern forming around me. And for the first time, I understood I needed to pay attention. Carefully, quietly, completely. The next morning, I sat at my desk and turned on my old desktop computer. I rarely used it anymore, but I wanted to see something they didn't expect me to check. I opened the browser and went to my bank site, then my insurance portal, then the email I've had for 20 years. Each one asked for a password. Each one rejected every version I typed. The same accounts I had used for years were suddenly out of my reach. The screen didn't say wrong password. It said access blocked. That was enough to make my jaw tighten. I opened my email on the secondary recovery page, the one nobody knew existed. Several alerts were waiting. Password reset attempts, security warnings, unfamiliar devices. All of them happened late at night, hours after I'd gone to sleep. The timestamps lined up with the same nights my son-in-law had stayed up finishing work. Seeing those alerts didn't surprise me as much as it should have. They simply confirmed what had already begun to take shape in my mind. I went to my bedroom and opened the drawer where I kept insurance paperwork, medical receipts, and my living will. I've kept those documents in the same order for years. They sat flat, untouched, filed neatly. Now the folder was crooked. The papers shifted just enough to show someone unfamiliar had slid through them. A few pages were out of order. My supplemental insurance form was sitting on top instead of under the main file. Nothing was missing, but someone had been studying what I had set aside for emergencies. Walking through the hallway, I passed my daughter in the kitchen. She looked up quickly from the pill organizer she insisted on keeping updated. I watched her count the tablets twice, glancing at the clock on the microwave. She never used to care what time I took my medication. In the last week, she'd reminded me 3 times a day. "Dad, did you take the morning pill? Dad, don't forget the afternoon one." Her voice carried a rehearsed concern, like she needed consistency for someone else's plan, not for my health. Later, her husband came into the living room where I sat reading the newspaper. He leaned on the back of the couch with an odd casualness. "How's your memory been lately?" he asked. "Any confusion? Forgetting things?" His tone was light, but the question wasn't. It wasn't the kind of thing people ask without reason. I told him I felt fine. He nodded slowly, the way a man does when he's already decided on the answer he wants. He drifted away without another word, but the conversation stayed with me. As the hours passed, I watched the way they both moved around me. Quiet, calculated, watchful. They weren't treating me like someone who was stable. They were treating me like someone whose decline they expected, someone they needed to monitor, someone they were preparing to speak for. I sat alone in the evening and let the threads pull tight. Passwords changed, accounts blocked, papers touched, medications monitored, health questions asked. Each action pointed to something I didn't want to accept, but could no longer ignore. They were shaping a story about me, a story where I was slipping, vulnerable, unable to manage my own life, and they were counting on me, not noticing. The phone rang in the late afternoon, a thin sound cutting through the quiet house. I answered expecting a routine reminder, but the nurse from my doctor's office spoke in a careful tone. She asked if I could confirm the request my daughter made earlier that day, something about deterioration documentation for my file. The words hit hard and clean, leaving no room for misunderstanding. I asked her to repeat it, and she did, slower this time. My daughter had asked them to prepare notes about a decline in my mental state. I felt the chair under me grow colder. I told the nurse I hadn't authorized anything. She paused, apologized, and said she would hold the request until she heard from me directly. Her professionalism didn't soften the impact. I thanked her and hung up, sitting still for a moment as the room shifted around me. This wasn't a password change or a moved folder. This was a written attempt to rewrite who I was. I found my daughter in the hallway, folding towels. I kept my voice steady and asked about the call. She blinked too quickly, then said she only asked the clinic for general updates. Her excuse didn't line up with what the nurse told me. She continued folding, giving me short, clipped sentences that dodged every clear question. The lie wasn't loud. It was practiced. She ended the conversation by saying it must have been a mix-up, but the timeline already contradicted her claim. Later that night, I opened the drawer with my insurance documents again, this time checking each page carefully. That's when I saw it, an authorization form placed between 2 older papers. It was an insurance consent document stating I approved a change in my medical representative. The signature at the bottom looked like mine, But something about the curve of the last letter was off. It wasn't sloppy. It was careful. Too careful. Someone had tried to copy my hand. I held the paper under the lamp, studying the ink as a cold understanding settled over me. This wasn't an exploration. They had begun taking steps. Quiet, official steps. People don't forge signatures lightly. They do it when they need access. They know they won't get willingly. My name on that page could hand over decisions that shape the rest of my life. Where I live, what care I receive, who controls my accounts. A slow, steady worry spread through my chest. Not wild or panicked, but sharp. If they were building a case that I was slipping mentally, one forged document could become 3. One phone call could become a file. One narrative could become truth on paper. And once that truth existed, it could be used to place me somewhere I didn't choose, with freedoms I couldn't reclaim. I set the form gently on the table and sat in silence. The danger wasn't vague anymore. It had a shape, a direction, a plan. I felt the betrayal in a deep, quiet place, but I didn't allow it to take over. Emotion wouldn't help me now. Awareness would. From that moment forward, I moved with intention. I began keeping a private list. Times, dates, changes, lies. I saved every email, recorded every unusual moment, and placed each piece in a folder they didn't know existed. If they wanted to build a story about me, I needed to build one of my own. One rooted in truth, evidence, and the determination to protect the life I still had. I went to the clinic in person the next morning, leaving the house before either of them woke. The waiting room was quiet, the kind of quiet that lets you hear your own pulse in your ears. When the doctor called me in, he gave me a long look, the kind reserved for someone who's walked in with heavier questions than they're willing to say out loud. I told him I needed to see every request made on my behalf in the last month. No explanations, no small talk, just the truth. He opened my file on the screen and turned it slightly toward me. My daughter's name appeared again and again. Requests for cognitive assessments, notations about observed forgetfulness, inquiries about long-term care options. The doctor scrolled slowly, watching my face. "These weren't initiated by you?" he asked. I shook my head. He nodded once, a quiet confirmation that he already suspected as much. Then he clicked open another document, an attempted medical proxy transfer. My daughter had submitted a form claiming I was becoming confused with medication and appointments and needed her to step in for safety. The form wasn't approved because it lacked my signed confirmation, but the intent was clear. She hadn't been preparing to help me. She had been preparing to speak for me. As he scrolled further, something else appeared. Notes from the front desk about repeated calls from her asking whether my insurance covered assisted placement evaluations. I felt a coldness settle through me. Not panic, not disbelief, just the steady weight of understanding. This wasn't drift. This wasn't misunderstanding. This was direction, purpose, design. The doctor leaned back and folded his hands. "You're stable," he said plainly. "Your vitals are normal. Your memory tests from 3 months ago were strong." He paused. Someone is trying to create a medical narrative that doesn't exist. Hearing it said, that clearly made something inside me sharpen. It's one thing to fear a possibility. It's another to have a professional put it in clean, clinical terms. She was shaping a version of me that could be controlled. When I left the clinic, I stopped by the bank on the same street. I didn't ask for details, just a general inquiry to see if anything unusual was happening. The woman at the desk frowned at her screen, tapping twice before telling me my account had been flagged for multiple third-party verification attempts. Someone had tried to access balances, credit eligibility, and retirement funds. The timing matched the medical requests almost perfectly. The picture was complete now. Health, assets, control, every piece lined up. Walking back to my car, the air felt thinner. I wasn't angry. I wasn't confused. I was coldly, quietly certain. They weren't waiting for me to decline. They were building the paperwork to declare it themselves. If they could present me as mentally slipping, they could take control of the decisions that shaped my remaining years. My home, my care, my accounts, my voice. That was the point of no return. I sat in the driver's seat and called a lawyer I knew from years back. I kept my voice steady, asking if he had time for a private consultation. He agreed without hesitation. I didn't tell him details on the phone. Some dangers shouldn't be spoken aloud until you're sitting across from someone who knows how to shield you. When I hung up, I looked at my reflection in the rearview mirror. I still recognized myself. I still knew my own mind, and I wasn't going to let anyone rewrite that while I was still alive to defend it. The lawyer listened to everything without interrupting. His eyes stayed steady, his pen unmoving, as if he didn't want a single detail to slip past him. When I finished, he leaned forward and spoke with the calm of a man who had handled too many cases like this. He told me to document everything: times, dates, conversations, changes in paperwork, medical requests. Don't confront them yet, he said. Protect yourself first. His voice was low, deliberate, carrying a kind of gravity that made each word settle deep. When I returned home, the house felt dimmer, even though the lights were on. I sat at my desk and began securing what I could. I changed every password on my accounts, writing them down on paper instead of storing them anywhere digital. I gathered my medical notes, insurance cards, bank statements, and tucked them into a folder that didn't leave my sight. I placed a copy of the forged signature inside, knowing I would need proof later. Each step tightened the knot in my stomach, but it also brought a strange steadiness with it. Preparation replacing fear, one small task at a time. At dinner, I tested something my lawyer suggested. A simple, harmless question. I asked my daughter if the clinic had called her again about updates. For a moment, her fork hovered just above the plate. Her eyes widened. Not much, but enough for a man who had raised her to recognize fear flashing under the surface. She swallowed hard and gave a rushed answer, repeating the same excuse she'd used before, only this time she added 2 details that contradicted her earlier story. Watching her scramble to stitch together an explanation confirmed more than any document could. Her husband reacted differently. He didn't speak at first. He just stared at me, his jaw tight, his fingers tapping a pattern against the table. When my daughter walked to the sink, he leaned back and watched me the way someone watches a door they expect to open. I felt the heat of his stare long after I left the room. The home I had lived in for decades no longer felt familiar. Every sound carried meaning. Steps in the hallway, whispers behind closed doors, the creak of the floor outside my room. Their movements had changed. They hovered more. They checked doors, peeked into rooms, paused whenever they thought I wasn't paying attention. The shift wasn't loud, but it was constant, intentional. I started leaving a small recorder in my pocket, switching it on whenever they spoke to me, not to trap them, but to protect myself from the new reality forming around me. My daughter grew bolder as the evening stretched on. She asked twice if I had taken my medication. She reminded me of an appointment I didn't have. She insisted I shouldn't stress myself, touching my arm with a practiced gentleness that didn't match the urgency in her voice. Each gesture felt like she was testing boundaries, gauging how much of the story she could shape before I noticed. I sat in my chair as the house settled into night, listening to their footsteps drift down the hallway. A stillness filled the air, thick and unmoving. I felt it settle inside me too. The truth was no longer something I could avoid. It had grown teeth, taken shape, and stepped into my home. Tonight, I realized, was the night it had to be faced. They came to my room together just after dark. I heard their footsteps pause outside the door before it opened without a knock. My daughter carried a stack of papers pressed tight against her chest, and her husband stood behind her with a stiff, fixed look that told me this wasn't a conversation. They had come with a plan. She said they needed my signature for some updates, her voice soft but strained, like she was holding something in. Her husband closed the door with the slow certainty of a man eliminating choices. She stepped closer and held out the papers. I asked what they were, and her eyes flicked to her husband before she answered. Something about medical coordination, something about making things easier. The excuses were thin, forced, built on the hope that I would be too tired or too trusting to look deeper. When I didn't reach for the forms, her husband stepped forward, jaw tight. "It's just paperwork," he said. "Sign it so we can move on." I stayed seated, hands steady on the armrests, watching the tension gather in his shoulders. My refusal unsettled him. He glanced at my nightstand, where my phone sat charging. He moved toward it as if he had a right to take it. I stood, blocking his path. The shift in the room was immediate. The air tightened, their patience cracked. My daughter's voice rose, not in a shout, but in a sharp, urgent whisper telling me I was making things harder than they needed to be. Her husband spoke over her, telling me I was confused, that I didn't understand what was best. Then came the moment they stopped pretending. He stepped close enough that I could smell the bitterness on his breath and said I was dragging my feet while they were trying to get things in order before it's too late. My daughter's face hardened behind him. No softness left, only a tired resentment that had been waiting for a chance to surface. She pushed the forms toward me, insisting again. When I didn't take them, her husband grabbed my wrist and guided it toward the pen on the table. It wasn't a violent shove. It didn't need to be. It was control, pure and simple. That was the moment I knew I had to end this. I pulled the small recorder from my pocket and switched it on where they could see it. Their eyes widened at the same time, the first honest reaction I had seen from either of them in days. Then I laid the forged form on the table and the printed verification from the clinic beside it. I told them calmly that the doctor confirmed every request they made. I told them the bank had flagged their attempts. I told them I had already spoken to a lawyer. My son-in-law's face broke first. The anger he'd been controlling slipped into panic. My daughter stepped back, her composure cracking as the walls they built began to fall, inward. She whispered his name, but he was already leaning toward me again, desperate and reckless, reaching for the folder I'd placed on the table. He didn't get the chance. A loud knock hit the front door, followed by our neighbor's voice calling my name. She'd heard the raised voices through the wall and came to check on me. When my daughter opened the door, the neighbors saw the scene, saw the tension, saw the papers. Within minutes, she was on the phone with the police. My daughter and her husband froze, not because of guilt, but because their timeline had collapsed. Their downfall didn't come from my evidence. It came from their own hands, their own pressure, their own arrogance. All I had to do was stand steady and let the truth show itself. The police arrived fast, quicker than I expected for a quiet street like mine. They stepped inside with firm voices and steady eyes, separating the three of us without giving anyone time to rewrite the scene. My daughter tried to speak first, but the officers stopped her, asking for identification, documents, and an explanation for why I appeared distressed. I didn't raise my voice or point fingers. I simply handed them the folder, every forged form, every medical request, every bank alert. They read in silence, their expressions tightening with each page. My son-in-law's patience snapped the moment they asked him about accessing my accounts. He tried to explain, then argue, then shift blame. But the officers had already heard enough. One of them asked me directly if I felt pressured or unsafe. I said yes, clearly and calmly. That was all they needed. They put him in cuffs without hesitation. My daughter stood frozen, eyes wide, shock spreading across her face, as if she expected the world to bend to the story she'd built. When they read her the list of actions she initiated, medical manipulation, attempted proxy transfer, unauthorized inquiries, she finally understood what she had done, not as a daughter, but as a participant in a crime. The house fell quiet once they were taken outside. I sat down at the table, breathing slowly, feeling the weight lift, not in relief, but in truth. It was over, at least the part I couldn't handle alone. The law had walked in where my voice wasn't enough. My lawyer arrived shortly after, his presence steady and reassuring. He reviewed the police report and told me they'd be facing charges ranging from fraud to attempted exploitation of a vulnerable adult. The words sounded heavy, but not dramatic, just accurate. He stayed long enough to secure emergency legal protections, ensuring my medical authority and financial rights remained fully in my hands. He also arranged a formal statement with the police, making sure every detail was recorded while it was still fresh. When he left, I went through the house room by room. I changed locks. I moved important documents to a safer place. I checked my computer, my accounts, my medication drawer, quiet. Tasks that brought a sense of order back into the space. The bank called to confirm that all unauthorized attempts had been flagged and reversed. Every balance was restored. Every hold was removed. Nothing had slipped through. Only then did the emotional truth settle in. It wasn't just the last few days that were dangerous. It was the years leading up to them. The comments I brushed off, the control I allowed out of trust, the slow shift in their behavior that I interpreted as stress or responsibility. Seeing it plainly now was like stepping into a cold room and finally recognizing the temperature for what it had been all along. I didn't cry. I didn't rage. I sat in the quiet and let the reality settle. They had been preparing to take over the rest of my life while I was still standing here, fully aware, still capable. The sorrow was sharp but clean. It didn't break me. It clarified me. That night, with the house empty and safe, I locked the door, checked it twice, and placed the folder of evidence inside a drawer I knew they'd never find again. For the first time in days, I slept without listening for footsteps in the hallway. The house felt different in the days that followed. Not empty, but honest. Without their voices filling the rooms, the silence finally told the truth I had tried to ignore. I walked through each hallway with a slower step, not because of age, but because I was carrying a new kind of understanding. I loved my daughter. That part had never been in question. But love, I've learned, can make a man look away from things he should face head on. I saw signs long before this. Small shifts, dismissive tones, a growing impatience. But I convinced myself it was marriage stress or the burden of adulthood. I didn't want to believe it was something darker. Looking back now, I see how entitlement doesn't arrive in a single moment. It grows like a quiet shadow. Small requests, small criticisms, small assumptions about what you owe someone. Over time, those shadows stack until they block out the light. And by the time you notice, you're already sitting in the dark. My daughter didn't wake up one morning planning to take my life out from under me. She slipped into it slowly, step by step, telling herself she deserved more, that I was an obstacle, that her convenience mattered more than my autonomy. That kind of thinking doesn't explode. It creeps. I spent too many years believing that being a good father meant being available, agreeable, generous. But the truth at my age is simpler than that. Being a good father doesn't mean handing over the keys to your own life. It doesn't mean letting others speak for you, think for you, or decide when your final chapter should begin. Independence isn't pride, it's survival. In the days after everything unfolded, I found myself sitting in the backyard with a cup of tea, watching the light fall across the grass. I felt a quiet strength settle in me. Not anger, not bitterness, just clarity. Healing doesn't come from blaming others or trying to understand what twisted them into the people they became. Healing comes from setting boundaries strong enough that no one can cross them again. It comes from choosing safety over sentiment, truth over illusion. I changed the locks again, even though it wasn't necessary. I updated my will, not out of spite, but out of protection. I appointed a neutral guardian for any future medical decisions, someone with no financial gain tied to my decline. I made sure every document reflected the man I still am, not the image they tried to paint of me. These weren't acts of fear. They were acts of self-respect. As the days turned calmer, I felt something inside me settle, an acceptance without sadness. Family can be our greatest comfort or our deepest wound. The difference lies in boundaries. I still care for my daughter, but that care no longer blinds me. It no longer writes excuses in place of truths. If there is one lesson I will carry into my final years, it is this: love your family with an open heart, but guard your life with clear eyes. Trust your instincts, protect your independence, and never hand someone the power to decide your future just because you share a last name.